The October wind rattled the windows of Martha Henderson's small frame house on Elm Street, carrying with it the scent of burning leaves and the promise of an early winter. She sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor of what had once been their bedroom, surrounded by cardboard boxes that she had been avoiding for nearly 2 years. Robert's belongings, carefully packed away by well-meaning neighbors after the telegram arrived, had remained untouched in the spare room, like a shrine to a life cut short. Martha pulled her wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she opened another box, this one containing Robert's personal effects that had been shipped back from Europe. His dog tags clinked softly against each other as she lifted them out, the metal cold against her palm. Beneath them lay a collection of letters she had written to him, their edges yellowed and some bearing water stains from whatever ordeal they had endured overseas. At the bottom of the box, her fingers found something unexpected, a small, leather-bound photo album she didn't remember packing. As she opened it, loose photographs spilled onto her lap. Most were pictures Robert had taken during his training at Fort Leonard Wood, smiling faces of young men who believed they were invincible. But one photograph made her breath catch in her throat. It was their wedding photo from September 1943, taken at First Presbyterian Church downtown. Martha remembered that day with crystal clarity, the way Robert's hands had shaken as he placed the ring on her finger, the smell of her mother's roses in her bouquet, the photographer's instructions to look natural and happy. But this copy of the photograph was badly damaged. A large water stain had warped the paper, creating a dark blotch across the right side of the image. A tear ran diagonally through the middle, separating her smiling face from Robert's. Martha held the photograph up to the lamplight, studying the damage. She could barely make out their faces through the discoloration, but the memory of that perfect day remained vivid in her mind. This had been Robert's copy, the one he carried with him overseas. The army had returned it with his other effects, but she had never seen it before now. A sudden gust of wind outside caused the house to creak, and Martha shivered despite the warmth from the furnace. She looked around the bedroom they had shared for less than a year before he shipped out, taking in the faded floral wallpaper and the empty space where his dresser used to stand. Everything felt hollow now, like an echo of the life they had planned together. She made a decision that surprised her with its spontaneity. Tomorrow, she would take the photograph to Kellerman's photography studio on Commercial Street. Mr. Kellerman had a reputation for working miracles with damaged photographs, and Martha suddenly felt desperate to see their faces clearly again, to remember what happiness looked like. As she carefully placed the damaged photograph back in its album, Martha noticed something that made her pause. In the corner of the image, barely visible through the water damage, she could make out what appeared to be a reflection in the church's ornate mirror that hung on the wall behind the altar. But the image was too distorted to make out any details. The wind picked up again, howling around the corners of the house, and somewhere in its sound Martha thought she heard something that made her heart skip a beat. It was probably just her imagination, but for just a moment it had sounded almost like someone calling her name. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, with low clouds that seemed to press down on Springfield like a heavy blanket. Martha walked down Commercial Street, her heels clicking against the wet pavement, the damaged photograph carefully wrapped in brown paper and tucked inside her purse. The downtown area bustled with the familiar rhythm of a city trying to rebuild itself after the war. Men in suits hurrying to work, women with shopping baskets, and the occasional veteran limping along on crutches or walking with the careful, measured steps of someone still learning to navigate the world again. Kellerman's photography studio occupied a narrow storefront between Hawthorne's drugstore and Miller's haberdashery. The painted sign above the door had faded to a pale blue, and the window display showcased portraits of local families, their faces frozen in formal poses that spoke of better times. A small bell chimed as Martha pushed open the door, stepping into a world that smelled of chemical developer and old paper. Samuel Kellerman emerged from behind a curtained partition that separated the front of the store from his darkroom. He was a thin man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands stained permanently grey from years of working with photographic chemicals. His accent still carried traces of his German heritage, despite having lived in Missouri for over 30 years. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, recognizing her immediately, "I heard about Robert. Such a terrible loss. He was a good man." Martha nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Everyone in town knew everyone else's business, and Robert's death had been front-page news in the Springfield Daily News. "Local hero killed in action," the headline had read, though the details had been frustratingly vague. "I have something I'd like you to look at," Martha said, carefully unwrapping the photograph. "It's damaged, but I was hoping you might be able to restore it." Kellerman took the photograph and held it up to the light, his experienced eyes scanning the water damage and tears. He made small clicking sounds with his tongue, the way a doctor might examine a particularly challenging case. "This has seen some rough treatment," he said finally. "Water damage, possibly from a river crossing or heavy rain. The emulsion is warped, and this tear goes right through the middle. But yes, I think I can help you. It will take some time, perhaps a week. I'll need to work very carefully to bring out the details without causing further damage." "Can you really make it clear again?" Martha asked, hope creeping into her voice for the first time in months. "Photography is like archaeology, Mrs. Henderson. The image is still there, hidden beneath the damage. We just have to be patient and careful in revealing it." He paused, studying the photograph again. "This was taken at First Presbyterian, wasn't it? I remember doing some work there myself years ago. Beautiful church, very photogenic with all those mirrors and stained glass windows." Martha felt a small chill run down her spine at the mention of mirrors, remembering the strange reflection she thought she had seen in the corner of the damaged image. "Yes, that's right. It was our wedding day, September 1943. Kellerman smiled gently. "Then, this is very precious indeed. I promise I'll treat it with the utmost care. Come back next Tuesday and we'll see what we can uncover." As Martha prepared to leave, Kellerman called out to her, "Mrs. Henderson, I don't mean to pry, but have you considered that sometimes it's better to let the past remain buried? Some photographs reveal more than we expect them to." His words struck her as oddly ominous, but when she turned back to ask what he meant, the old photographer had already disappeared behind his curtain, leaving only the smell of chemicals and the tick of the studio's old clock to mark the passage of time. That evening, Martha sat in her small kitchen, picking at a dinner of canned soup and day-old bread. The house felt different somehow, as if leaving the photograph with Mr. Kellerman had disturbed some delicate balance she hadn't even known existed. Outside, the October wind continued its restless dance through the elm trees, casting shifting shadows across the kitchen walls. She had tried to occupy herself with mundane tasks, mending a torn slip, organizing her small collection of ration books, writing a letter to her sister in Kansas City, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the damaged photograph and Kellerman's strange parting words. "Some photographs reveal more than we expect them to." What had he meant by that? As the evening deepened, Martha moved to the living room and turned on the radio, hoping the familiar voices of her favorite programs would chase away the growing unease. The Philco radio, a wedding gift from Robert's parents, crackled to life with the closing theme of the Jack Benny program. She settled into Robert's old armchair, pulling a quilt around her shoulders. As the announcer's voice filled the room with news of the day, President Truman's latest policies, updates on the reconstruction efforts in Europe, the continuing trials of war criminals in Nuremberg. At exactly 9:30, just as she was considering turning in for the night, the radio began to behave strangely. The volume fluctuated on its own, rising and falling like breathing, and static crept into the signal despite the clear evening weather. Martha reached over to adjust the tuning dial, but as her hand touched the knob, the static cleared completely, and a song began to play. It was "I'll Be Seeing You," the same song that had played during their first dance as husband and wife. Martha's hand froze on the radio dial as Billie Holiday's voice filled the room with achingly familiar lyrics. This wasn't possible. The song wasn't scheduled to play on any program she knew of, and the local stations had signed off for the night hours ago. The music seemed to come from somewhere far away, tinged with the quality of a distant transmission. As the song played, the temperature in the room began to drop noticeably. Martha could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air, and the quilt around her shoulders provided no warmth against the unnatural cold. But it was what happened next that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. As Billie Holiday sang about seeing you in all the old familiar places, Martha heard something impossible, a man's voice, barely audible beneath the music, humming along to the melody. The voice was deep, warm, and achingly familiar. It was Robert's voice. Martha shot up from the chair so quickly that the quilt fell to the floor. She stared at the radio in disbelief, her heart hammering against her ribs. The humming continued for a few more bars, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, both the song and the voice faded into static. The radio returned to its normal late-evening silence, and the warmth gradually seeped back into the room. She stood there for a long moment, trying to convince herself that it had been her imagination, that grief could play cruel tricks on the mind. But deep down, she knew what she had heard. Robert had been there, somehow, in that music. The same Robert who was supposed to be buried in a military cemetery somewhere in Belgium. Martha turned off the radio with shaking hands and walked through the house, checking the locks on all the doors and windows. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she paused at the landing, looking back down at the living room where the impossible had just occurred. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. She needed to see that photograph restored, needed to understand what was happening to her. Because if Robert was somehow trying to reach her from beyond the grave, she had to know why. Sleep refused to come that night. Martha lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to every creak and whisper of the old house. The radiator clanked irregularly, and the wind continued its assault on the windows. But beneath these familiar sounds, she found herself straining to hear something else. A footstep, a voice, any sign that she wasn't alone in the darkness. At 2:47 a.m. she finally drifted off, only to be awakened 30 minutes later by the sound of the radio downstairs crackling to life again. This time, she didn't hesitate. Wrapping her robe around her shoulders, Martha crept down the stairs, each step carefully placed to avoid the boards she knew would squeak. The living room was bathed in the pale green glow of the radio's dial light. Static filled the air, punctuated by fragments of distant voices speaking in languages she couldn't identify. As she approached the radio, the static began to clear, and once again, "I'll be seeing you," drifted through the speakers. But this time, Martha was ready. She sat down in Robert's chair and listened intently, not just to the music, but to everything around it. The cold returned, settling over her like a familiar blanket, and she realized it wasn't threatening. It was comforting, like Robert's presence had always been. "Robert," she whispered to the empty room, "is that really you?" The music faltered for a moment, and in the brief silence that followed, Martha heard something that made her heart race. It was the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, and definitely not her own. Then through the speakers came a voice so faint she had to strain to hear it. "Martha." The word was stretched thin, as if traveling across an impossible distance. "Martha." The photograph, the transmission dissolved into static, and no matter how long she waited or how desperately she called his name, Robert's voice didn't return. The radio eventually went silent, leaving Martha alone with her thoughts and a certainty that defied all rational explanation. Her husband was trying to tell her something, and it had to do with the damaged photograph she had left with Mr. Kellerman. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and anticipation. Martha went through the motions of her daily routine, shopping for groceries, attending church services, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors, but her mind was elsewhere. Every night, the radio came on by itself at exactly 3:17 a.m., always playing the same song, always accompanied by Robert's distant voice trying to break through the static. She began keeping a notebook beside the radio, writing down every word she could make out. Most of the messages were fragments. "Behind you," not what they told you. "The mirror," but gradually, a pattern began to emerge. Robert was trying to warn her about something connected to the circumstances of his death and the photograph they had taken on their wedding day. By Monday evening, Martha was barely functioning on 3 hours of sleep per night. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and her hands shook from too much coffee and too little food. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had knocked on her door twice to check on her, commenting that she looked peaked and asking if she needed anything from the store. Martha couldn't tell her the truth, that her dead husband was trying to communicate with her through the radio, that their house had become some kind of supernatural telephone exchange. Instead, she smiled and made excuses about not sleeping well since the weather had turned cold. As she prepared for bed on Monday night, Martha found herself both dreading and anticipating the 3:17 a.m. visitation. Tomorrow she would pick up the restored photograph from Mr. Kellerman, and perhaps then she would finally understand what Robert was trying to tell her. The answers were hidden somewhere in that damaged image, and she was running out of time to decode the message from beyond the grave. Tuesday morning arrived with a bitter frost that coated the windows in delicate ice crystals. Martha barely noticed the cold as she hurried down Commercial Street toward Kellerman's photography studio, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. She had spent the previous night writing down every fragment of Robert's messages, trying to piece together their meaning before seeing the photograph. The studio bell chimed her arrival, and Mr. Kellerman looked up from his work counter with satisfaction, evident in his weathered features. He held up a manila envelope with the careful reverence of someone presenting a precious artifact. "Mrs. Henderson, I must say, this was one of my more challenging restorations," he said, his German accent slightly more pronounced than usual. "The damage was extensive, but the results, well, you'll see for yourself." Martha's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. Through the thin paper, she could feel the smooth surface of the restored photograph, waiting to reveal its secrets. "I should warn you," Kellerman continued, his voice taking on the same ominous tone from their first meeting. "In bringing out the details, I may have revealed more than you were expecting to see. Sometimes the camera captures things that our eyes miss in the moment." Without waiting for his full explanation, Martha carefully opened the envelope and withdrew the photograph. What she saw made her gasp audibly and step backward, her free hand reaching for the counter to steady herself. The restoration was flawless. Every detail of their wedding day had been brought into crystal-clear focus. Her white dress with its pearl buttons, Robert's nervous smile, the elaborate decorations of First Presbyterian Church. But it was the background that stole the breath from her lungs. In the ornate mirror that hung on the wall behind the altar, clearly visible now that the water damage had been removed, stood a figure that made no logical sense. It was Robert. Not the Robert standing beside her in the photograph, but another Robert, positioned directly behind where Martha stood. This second Robert looked older, his uniform torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. His face bore an expression of desperate urgency, as if he were trying to call out to her across an impossible distance. Most disturbing of all, this reflected Robert was pointing at something outside the frame of the mirror, his mouth open as if shouting a warning that the camera had captured, but rendered silent. "This is impossible," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the tick of the studio clock. "Robert was standing right beside me when this was taken. He couldn't be behind me and beside me at the same time." Kellerman nodded gravely. "I thought you might say that. In my 50 years of photography, I've seen some strange things develop in the darkroom. Sometimes the camera sees across time, Mrs. Henderson. Sometimes it captures not just what was, but what would be." Martha stared at the image, her mind reeling. The Robert in the mirror wasn't the healthy young man who had married her in 1943. This was Robert as he must have appeared at the moment of his death, wounded, desperate, and trying to send her a message across the years. "What is he pointing at?" she asked, her voice growing stronger with determination. "That, I cannot tell you. But if I were you, I would look very carefully at everything in this photograph. Every detail, every shadow, every reflection. The dead don't usually work so hard to communicate with the living unless the message is urgent." Martha carefully placed the photograph back in its envelope, her mind already racing with possibilities. She needed to get home and study every inch of the image, to decode whatever warning Robert was trying to send her. The nightly radio visits suddenly made sense. He had been preparing her for this moment, for the revelation that would change everything she thought she knew about his death. As she prepared to leave the studio, Kellerman called out to her one final time. "Mrs. Henderson, be careful. Some truths are more dangerous than the lies they replace." Martha spread the restored photograph across her kitchen table under the bright light of her reading lamp, using a magnifying glass from Robert's old desk to examine every detail. The image was even more disturbing in the privacy of her own home, where she could study it without Mr. Kellerman's watchful eyes or the distraction of other customers. The Robert in the mirror was definitely pointing at something beyond the photograph's edge, his face contorted with what looked like fear and urgency. Martha traced the direction of his pointing finger with her own, trying to imagine what might have been standing just outside the camera's view during their wedding ceremony. She remembered that day with startling clarity, now that the photograph had jarred her memory. They had posed for several pictures after the ceremony, and during one of them, she recalled hearing a commotion near the church entrance. Someone had dropped a tray of rice that guests were supposed to throw as they left the church. At the time, it had seemed like a minor accident, but now Martha wondered if there had been more to it. Using the magnifying glass, she studied every inch of the photograph's background. In the corner opposite the mirror, she noticed something she had never seen before, a shadow that seemed wrong, too angular to be cast by any of the church's furnishings. It looked almost like a person crouching behind one of the pews, watching the ceremony unfold. As afternoon faded into evening, Martha began to feel the familiar chill that preceded Robert's nightly visitations, but this time, instead of waiting for 3:17 a.m., she decided to take action. She placed the photograph on top of the radio and sat down to wait. At exactly 6:43 p.m., the radio crackled to life. Instead of the usual song, however, static filled the room, punctuated by what sounded like Morse code, dots and dashes transmitted through the supernatural connection Robert had established. Martha grabbed a pencil and began writing down the pattern. She had learned Morse code during the war, when she worked as a volunteer at the Red Cross station, helping to coordinate communications with overseas units. The message that came through was brief but chilling. Betrayed, stop, not Germans. Stop, Charlie knows, stop, find Charlie, stop. The transmission ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Martha staring at the decoded message with growing horror. Charlie, she knew only one Charlie who had been in Robert's unit. Charles Morrison, Robert's best friend since childhood, had enlisted with him and served in the same company throughout their deployment to Europe. Charlie had been one of the soldiers who had returned home after the war ended, and he lived just 3 miles away in a small apartment above Henderson's grocery. Martha had seen Charlie several times since his return, usually at the grocery store or around town, but she had always found their encounters uncomfortable. Charlie seemed unable to meet her eyes when they spoke about Robert, and he always changed the subject quickly whenever she asked about the circumstances of her husband's death. She had attributed his discomfort to survivor's guilt, but now she wondered if there was something more sinister behind his evasiveness. The photograph suddenly felt heavy in her hands, weighted with secrets that had been hidden for over 2 years. If Robert's message was accurate, then his death hadn't been the result of enemy action as the army had reported. Someone had betrayed him, and that someone was still alive, still walking the streets of Springfield, while Robert lay in a grave thousands of miles away. As Martha prepared for bed that night, she made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would pay a visit to Charlie Morrison and demand the truth about what had really happened to her husband during those final days of the war. The ghost in the photograph had pointed her toward answers, and she was determined to follow that spectral finger wherever it led, no matter how dangerous the journey might prove to be. The radio remained silent that night, as if Robert knew his message had been received and understood. But Martha could feel his presence in the house more strongly than ever before, a watchful spirit, waiting to see if she would have the courage to uncover the truth he had died trying to reveal. The next morning, Martha dressed carefully in her best wool coat and walked the 3 miles to Henderson's grocery with the restored photograph tucked securely in her purse. The October air was crisp and clear, but her breath came in short bursts that had nothing to do with the cold. Every step brought her closer to answers she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Henderson's grocery occupied the ground floor of a brick building on the edge of downtown Springfield. The familiar smell of coffee and fresh bread greeted her as she pushed through the door. But instead of heading to the counter, Martha climbed the narrow wooden stairs at the back of the store that led to the apartments above. Charlie Morrison's door was marked with a simple brass number 2. Martha stood outside for a long moment, listening to the sounds from within, the shuffle of footsteps, the distant murmur of a radio program. When she finally knocked, the sound stopped abruptly, as if whoever was inside had frozen at the unexpected visitor. "Charlie, it's Martha Henderson. I need to speak with you." The silence stretched for nearly a minute before she heard the slow scrape of multiple locks being undone. The door opened just a crack, revealing half of Charlie's face. He looked older than his 29 years, his hair already showing grey at the temples, and his eyes held the haunted quality she had seen in too many veterans since the war ended. "Martha," he said, his voice hoarse with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I think you know why I'm here, Charlie. May I come in?" Charlie hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the hallway, as if checking to see if she had brought anyone with her. Finally, he stepped back and opened the door wider, gesturing for her to enter. The apartment was sparse and neat, furnished with the bare minimum: a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. What struck Martha most was how temporary it all looked, as if Charlie were ready to pack up and leave at a moment's notice. "Would you like some coffee?" Charlie asked, moving toward a small hot plate in the corner. "No, thank you. I'd like some answers instead." Charlie's shoulders sagged, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked directly into her eyes. What she saw there made her take a step backward. It was guilt, raw and consuming, the kind that ate at a person's soul until there was nothing left but regret. "How much do you know?" he asked quietly. Martha pulled the photograph from her purse and placed it on the small table between them. Charlie's face went white as he stared at the restored image, his eyes immediately drawn to the mirror in the background. I know that Robert is trying to tell me something, Martha said, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. I know that he wasn't killed by Germans, and I know that you've been lying to me for 2 years about what really happened over there. Charlie slumped into one of the chairs, his head falling into his hands. When he looked up again, tears were streaming down his face. I never wanted this to happen, Martha. You have to believe that. Robert was my best friend. I would have died for him. But you didn't die for him, did you, Charlie? Instead, you let him die for you. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Charlie's breathing became labored, and Martha could see his hands shaking as he reached for a pack of cigarettes on the table. It's not that simple, he said, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. You don't understand what it was like over there in those final weeks. The Germans were retreating, but there were still pockets of resistance, and the SS were executing anyone they suspected of being deserters or collaborators. What does that have to do with Robert's death? Charlie took a long drag from his cigarette, buying himself time to find the words. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There was a German officer, a man named Klaus Weber. He had been feeding information to our unit for months, helping us avoid ambushes and locate supply depots. But when the war started winding down, Weber wanted something in return for all the intelligence he had provided. Martha felt her stomach drop as she began to understand where the story was heading. What did he want? Safe passage to America, a new identity. Weber knew the Allies were going to hunt down SS officers after the war, and he wanted to disappear before that happened. He offered to trade one final piece of intelligence, the location of a major German ammunition depot, in exchange for help getting out of Europe. And Robert agreed to this? Charlie shook his head violently. No, that's just it. Robert refused. He said it was treason, that Weber was a war criminal who deserved to face justice. But His voice broke completely. I had already made the deal, Martha. I had already promised Weber that we would help him escape. Charlie's cigarette burned down to his fingers, but he didn't seem to notice the pain. His eyes were fixed on something far beyond the confines of the small apartment, lost in memories that had clearly haunted him every day since his return from Europe. Tell me the rest, Martha said, her voice harder than she had ever heard it. Tell me exactly how my husband died. Charlie stubbed out the cigarette and immediately lit another one. Weber was supposed to meet us at a farmhouse outside of a town called Malmedy on December 16th, 1944. The plan was simple. We would escort him to Allied lines and claim he was a defector with valuable intelligence. From there, Weber had contacts who would help him disappear into the American occupation forces. Martha felt sick to her stomach, but she forced herself to remain calm. And Robert found out about this plan. Not until it was too late to stop it. We were already at the farmhouse when Robert realized what was happening. When he saw Weber there waiting for us, he knew immediately that I had betrayed everything we had sworn to uphold as soldiers. Charlie's hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold his cigarette. Robert went crazy, Martha. He pulled his sidearm and pointed it at Weber, said he was placing him under arrest as a war criminal. Weber started to run and Robert went after him. What did you do? The question hung in the air for a long moment before Charlie found the courage to answer. I shot him, Martha. I shot Robert in the back to stop him from killing Weber and exposing what I had done. The words hit Martha like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the table to keep herself from falling, her vision blurring with tears of rage and disbelief. Her husband hadn't died heroically in battle against the enemy. He had been murdered by his best friend to cover up an act of treason. But that's not the worst part, Charlie continued, his voice now completely broken. Weber wasn't just any SS officer. He was Klaus Weber, one of the men responsible for the Malmedy massacre. 2 days after Robert died, Weber and his unit murdered 84 American prisoners of war in cold blood. If I had listened to Robert, if I had let him arrest Weber when he wanted to, those men would still be alive. Martha stared at Charlie in horror, finally understanding the full scope of his betrayal. Not only had he murdered Robert, but his actions had indirectly led to the deaths of nearly 100 other American soldiers. How did you cover it up? She asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. I told our commanding officer that Robert had been killed by German snipers while we were on patrol. I said I had seen the muzzle flash from a nearby farmhouse, but couldn't locate the shooter. Weber was long gone by then, probably already making his way toward Allied lines with his fake documents. And the official report? Listed Robert as killed in action during the Battle of the Bulge, a hero's death. Charlie laughed bitterly. They even recommended him for a posthumous Bronze Star, but I made sure that recommendation got lost in the paperwork. I couldn't stand the thought of him being honored for something that was really my fault. Martha looked down at the photograph on the table, at Robert's ghostly reflection pointing desperately at something outside the frame. Now she understood what he had been trying to warn her about all these weeks. The shadow in the corner of the wedding photo wasn't random. It was Weber, already watching them, already planning the betrayal that would eventually cost Robert his life. "Where is Weber now?" Martha asked. Charlie's face went even paler, if that was possible. "That's what I've been afraid you'd ask. Weber didn't just disappear into the occupation forces, Martha. He made it to America, just like he planned. He's been living here under a false identity for the past 2 years. "Where?" Charlie met her eyes for the first time since beginning his confession, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. "He's here, Martha. Klaus Weber is living right here in Springfield, Missouri. He's been watching you, watching me, making sure we never tell anyone what really happened. And now that you know the truth, I'm afraid neither one of us is safe anymore." Martha's world tilted on its axis as Charlie's words sank in. Klaus Weber, the man responsible for her husband's death and the massacre of 84 American soldiers, was living somewhere in her own town, breathing the same air, walking the same streets she walked every day. "What name is he using?" Martha demanded, her voice like steel. Charlie hesitated, looking toward the window as if Weber might be watching them at that very moment. "Carl Weber. He's been working as a clerk at the First National Bank downtown for the past 18 months. Speaks perfect English. Claims to be a German-American from Pennsylvania who lost his records in a fire." The irony was staggering. Weber had been hiding in plain sight, handling the finances of the very community he had helped traumatize through his wartime actions. Martha thought of all the times she might have passed him on the street, unknowing that she was looking at her husband's murderer. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "Because he's been blackmailing me since the day I got back to Springfield," Charlie said, crushing his cigarette into an overflowing ashtray. "Weber knows I can expose him, but I know he can expose me too. We've been locked in this sick dance for 2 years, each of us knowing the other's secrets, neither of us able to make a move. What does he want from you?" "Information, mostly. Details about which veterans in town might have served in units that encountered him during the war. Names of people who might recognize him. He's been very careful to avoid anyone who might blow his cover." Martha stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked Main Street. Down below, people went about their normal lives, completely unaware that a war criminal was living among them. She thought about Robert's ghostly messages, his desperate attempts to warn her about the danger that surrounded her. "We have to go to the authorities," she said finally. Charlie shook his head. "And tell them what? That I murdered an American soldier to help a Nazi escape, that I've been covering it up for 2 years. Martha, if this comes out, I'll spend the rest of my life in prison. They might even execute me for treason." "You should have thought about that before you pulled the trigger," Martha replied coldly. "You don't understand. Weber has evidence of what I did. Photographs, documents, even a recording of me confessing the whole thing to him. If I try to expose him, he'll destroy me first." Martha turned back to face Charlie, and something in her expression made him shrink back in his chair. "You're more afraid of going to prison than you are of letting Robert's murderer walk free. It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple, Charlie. You made a choice 2 years ago that got my husband killed, and you're still making the same selfish choices now." Before Charlie could respond, they both heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs outside the apartment. Heavy, measured steps that seemed to pause outside Charlie's door. Both of them froze, staring at the entrance as if it might explode inward at any moment. A soft knock echoed through the small room, followed by a voice with just the faintest trace of a German accent. "Charles, I know you have a visitor. We need to talk." Charlie's face went white as paper. He mouthed a single word to Martha: "Weber." Martha felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but instead of fear, she was surprised to find herself filled with a cold, calculating rage. This was the man who had destroyed her life, who had turned her husband's best friend into a murderer, and then used that crime to blackmail his way into American society. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Charles, please don't make this difficult. I simply want to meet Mrs. Henderson and discuss our mutual situation. I'm sure we can come to some arrangement that benefits everyone involved." Martha looked at Charlie, who was paralyzed with terror in his chair. Then she looked at the photograph of her wedding day, at Robert's ghostly reflection pointing toward this moment, this confrontation that had been inevitable since the day Weber decided to trade American lives for his own freedom. She walked to the door, and before Charlie could stop her, turned the locks and pulled it open. Klaus Weber was smaller than she had expected, a thin man in his 40s with prematurely grey hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalogue and file away every detail of her appearance. He wore a well-tailored suit and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, offering a slight bow, "I have been very much looking forward to meeting you." Weber stepped into the apartment without invitation, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the sparse room, before settling on the photograph that still lay on the table. A smile played at the corners of his mouth as he recognized the image. "Ah, the wedding photograph," he said, his English precise despite the faint accent. "Charles told me you had it restored. How interesting that the camera captured so much more than the photographer intended." Martha felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the supernatural presence she had grown accustomed to. This was a different kind of cold, the kind that came from standing in the presence of pure evil. "You know about the reflection in the mirror," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Weber nodded, moving closer to examine the photograph. "I have made it my business to know many things about you, Mrs. Henderson. Your daily routines, your friends, your late-night radio transmissions that have been disturbing the neighbors." The casual mention of Robert's supernatural communications made Martha's blood run cold. Weber had been watching her house, probably for weeks or even months, cataloguing her activities and waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. "What do you want?" Martha asked. "What I have always wanted, my dear lady. Security, peace of mind, the assurance that my new life in America will not be disrupted by inconvenient revelations about my past." Charlie finally found his voice from the corner where he cowered. "Weber, please. Martha doesn't know anything that could hurt you. Just let her go, and we can continue our arrangement like before." Weber turned toward Charlie with an expression of mild disappointment. "But that is where you are wrong, Charles. Mrs. Henderson now knows everything. She knows about your betrayal, about my escape, about the true circumstances of her husband's death. She has become what we call in German a loose end." "You can't hurt her," Charlie said, standing up with shaking legs. "I won't let you." Weber laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You won't let me? Charles, you seem to have forgotten our arrangement. You belong to me now, just as you have belonged to me since that night at the farmhouse. Your conscience, your guilt, your fear, they are all mine to command." Martha looked back and forth between the two men, understanding finally that Charlie was as much Weber's victim as Robert had been. The German had been manipulating Charlie's guilt for 2 years, using it to control him and ensure his silence. "What happened to my husband's body?" Martha asked suddenly. The question seemed to surprise Weber. "An interesting inquiry. Why do you ask?" "Because if you're going to kill me, I want to know where Robert is buried. I want to know if he's really in that military cemetery in Belgium like the army told me." Weber studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether the question was genuine or if she was playing for time. Finally he shrugged. "Your husband's body was never recovered, Mrs. Henderson. Charles here told his commanding officer that Robert had fallen into a river during the firefight with German snipers. In reality, I disposed of the body myself to ensure there would be no inconvenient evidence of the true cause of death." Martha felt her knees go weak. All this time she had imagined Robert resting peacefully in a military cemetery, surrounded by other fallen heroes. Instead, his body had been discarded like refuse by the very man he had died trying to stop. "Where?" she whispered. "In a mass grave with other victims of the war. I'm afraid the exact location has become somewhat unclear in my memory." The casual cruelty of Weber's words ignited something in Martha that she didn't know existed. She thought of Robert's desperate attempts to communicate with her through the radio, his ghostly reflection in the wedding photograph pointing toward this moment of truth. He had been trying to guide her here, to this confrontation, because he knew it was the only way justice would ever be served. "You're going to pay for what you did," Martha said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Not just to Robert, but to all those soldiers at Malmedy. You think you can hide in our town, pretend to be one of us, but I know who you really are." Weber's smile faded, replaced by something much more dangerous. "Mrs. Henderson, I think you misunderstand your situation. You are not here to threaten me. You are here to listen to my terms for allowing you to continue breathing." As he spoke, Weber reached into his jacket and withdrew a small pistol, the same type of German-issue sidearm that Martha had seen in photographs from the war. The weapon looked almost delicate in his pale hands, but she had no doubt that he knew exactly how to use it. "Now then," Weber said, his voice taking on the tone of a businessman discussing a contract. "Let us talk about how we are going to resolve this unfortunate situation." The small apartment felt like a tomb as Weber held the pistol steady, his pale eyes moving between Martha and Charlie with the calculating patience of a predator. Martha could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, but beneath that sound she became aware of something else, a familiar presence that seemed to fill the room with an electric tension. The temperature began to drop rapidly, and Martha saw her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. Weber noticed it too, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around the room, trying to identify the source of the unnatural cold. "Interesting," he murmured. "Charles mentioned that you had been experiencing some unusual phenomena at your home. Tell me, Mrs. Henderson, do you believe in ghosts?" Before Martha could answer, the radio in the corner of the room crackled to life, even though it wasn't plugged into the wall. Static filled the air, but underneath the white noise, a pattern began to emerge. It was Morse code again, but this time the signal was stronger and clearer than it had ever been. Weber spun toward the radio, his composure finally beginning to crack. "What is this, some kind of trick?" Martha didn't need to decode the message this time. She could hear Robert's voice speaking directly through the static, his words clear and unmistakable. "Hello, Klaus, remember me?" Weber's face went ashen, and the pistol wavered in his trembling hand. "This is impossible. You're dead. I watched you die." "Yes, you did," Robert's voice continued, seeming to come from every corner of the room at once. "You shot me in the back while I was trying to stop you from escaping justice. But death doesn't end everything, Klaus. Sometimes it just gives us a different perspective on what needs to be done." The lights in the apartment began to flicker, and objects on the table started to vibrate as if the building were experiencing an earthquake. Charlie pressed himself against the wall, his eyes wide with terror, while Weber spun in circles trying to track the source of the voice. "You can't hurt me," Weber said, but his voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. "You're just a voice on the radio, a dead man's echo." "You're right," Robert replied. "I can't hurt you directly, but I can do something else. I can make sure the truth finally comes to light." Suddenly the apartment door burst open, and two men in dark suits entered with their own weapons drawn. Behind them came Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man Martha recognized from church services. "Nobody move!" Bradley shouted. "This is the Springfield Police Department." Weber's eyes darted between the newcomers and the radio, which continued to crackle with Robert's voice. "You see, Klaus, I've been busy these past few weeks. While you were watching Martha, I was reaching out to other people who needed to know the truth about what really happened in Belgium." One of the men in suits stepped forward, his badge visible now as he held it up for Weber to see. "Klaus Weber, also known as Karl Weber, you are under arrest for war crimes committed during World War II, including the murders of American prisoners of war and the death of Sergeant Robert Henderson." Weber's face twisted with rage and desperation. He raised his pistol toward Martha, but before he could pull the trigger, Charlie Morrison did something that surprised everyone in the room. He lunged forward, tackling Weber around the waist and sending both men crashing to the floor. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, and within seconds the federal agents had Weber in handcuffs. Charlie lay on the floor, breathing heavily, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the table during the struggle. "Charlie Morrison," one of the agents said, producing another set of handcuffs. "You're also under arrest for the murder of Sergeant Robert Henderson and conspiracy to aid a war criminal." Charlie nodded, not resisting as they cuffed his hands behind his back. For the first time in 2 years, his face showed something that might have been peace. "I'm sorry, Martha," he said, as they helped him to his feet. "I'm so damn sorry for everything." Martha looked at him, this broken man who had carried the weight of his betrayal for so long that it had nearly destroyed him. "I know you are, Charlie, and I think Robert knows it too." The radio crackled one more time, and Robert's voice filled the room with words that seemed to encompass forgiveness, justice, and finally, farewell. "Take care of yourself, Martha. I love you. It's time for me to go." The temperature in the room returned to normal, and the oppressive presence that had filled the air lifted like a burden being removed from everyone's shoulders. Weber was dragged from the apartment, still protesting his innocence in rapid German, while Charlie followed more quietly, his head bowed in defeat and resignation. Sheriff Bradley approached Martha with a gentle expression. "Ma'am, I know this has been traumatic for you. We're going to need you to come down to the station and give us a full statement about everything that happened here." Martha nodded, picking up the restored photograph from the table where it had witnessed the final confrontation. In the corner of the image, she noticed something that made her smile through her tears, The mysterious shadow that had lurked behind the church pews was gone, leaving only the clear, untroubled reflection of her wedding day. 3 months later, Martha stood in the small cemetery behind First Presbyterian Church, holding a simple wooden cross that bore Robert's name and dates of service. The federal agents had been unable to locate Robert's actual remains, but they had confirmed through extensive investigation that everything he had communicated through the radio had been accurate. Weber's trial was making national headlines, and several other war criminals had been identified and arrested based on information he provided in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Charlie Morrison had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, but his cooperation with the authorities and his final act of protecting Martha had earned him some measure of leniency. Before his sentencing, he had asked to speak with Martha one last time. "I know I can never make up for what I did," he had told her through the bars of his cell, "but maybe spending the rest of my life in prison will be a start. Robert deserved better than the friend I turned out to be." Martha had found, to her surprise, that she could forgive Charlie. Not forget, she would never forget what his cowardice had cost her, but forgive. Robert's spirit had shown her that holding on to hatred only poisoned the person carrying it, and she was ready to let go of that burden. Now, as she placed the memorial cross in the soft earth of the church cemetery, Martha felt a sense of closure that had eluded her for nearly 3 years. The radio in her house had remained silent since that night in Charlie's apartment, but she no longer felt alone in the world. Robert's final message had been clear. He was at peace now, and it was time for her to find peace as well. "Mrs. Henderson?" Martha turned to find Samuel Kellerman approaching through the cemetery, his weathered face showing concern. She had become something of a local celebrity since the story broke in the newspapers, and people often approached her with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. "Mr. Kellerman, what brings you here? I wanted to return something to you," he said, pulling a manila envelope from his coat. "After everything that happened, I thought you might want the original damaged photograph back. Sometimes the broken things tell more truth than the restored ones." Martha accepted the envelope and looked inside at the water-stained, torn image that had started everything. In its damaged state, Robert's ghostly reflection was barely visible, just a hint of something that could have been imagination, but she knew better now. "Thank you," she said. "I think I'll keep both versions. They're part of the same story, just different chapters." Kellerman nodded approvingly. "That's very wise. The past and the present, they're not separate things. They're all part of the same photograph, if you know how to look at it right." As the old photographer walked away, Martha remained by the memorial cross for a few more minutes, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the bare branches of the elm trees. Spring was coming to Missouri, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. That evening, Martha returned to her house on Elm Street and went through her familiar routine, preparing dinner, listening to the radio programs, reading before bed. But everything felt different now. The house was no longer a mausoleum to her lost life with Robert, but simply a home where a woman lived who had loved deeply and been loved in return. At exactly 9:30, she turned off the radio and prepared for bed. There would be no supernatural visitations tonight, no desperate messages from beyond the grave. Robert had completed his mission and found his rest, and Martha had found something she hadn't expected, the strength to begin building a new life from the ashes of the old one. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Martha paused at the landing and looked back at the living room where she had first heard Robert's voice calling to her through the static. She smiled, remembering not the pain of his death, but the joy of their time together, and the extraordinary love that had reached across the boundary between life and death to ensure that justice was finally served. "Good night, Robert," she whispered to the empty house. "Rest well." The house settled around her with familiar creaks and sighs, but they were no longer the sounds of loneliness. They were the sounds of a home where love had lived, where truth had triumphed, and where a woman had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning how to let go. Outside, the October wind that had once carried such foreboding messages now rustled gently through the elm trees, whispering not of secrets and betrayal, but of peace, justice, and the eternal power of love to transcend even death itself. Martha Henderson slept soundly that night, and for the first time in 3 years, her dreams were filled not with sorrow, but with hope for the tomorrow that awaited her.